So we've got a good idea of kind of what Hiero is and Hedera's kind of position in this new kind of entity. And now we start to talk about the past, the future, what this means. And I think a really great place to start is from a community question that I
Yeah,
think it was funny. You responded to and was like, oh, I'm just going to talk about this on, on Brandon's
yeah,
show. But the
yeah,
community question was, what influence does the Hedera Governing Council hold over this Hiero project? Would the goals and incentives of Hedera and Hiero ever be misaligned? And kind of like, how does this change or not change the Hedera Governing Council?
yeah. I think this is a really fundamental question, and it's one that we spent a long time on before making this move. So, to provide a little bit of context, this this idea of going to a foundation is something that we've discussed at the board level, the GC level, for a long time.
Mm.
And one of the things that was very central to the decision making process was, what is the relationship between Hedera and Hiero? Of course, we didn't have a name for it at the time, but
Right.
you know, what's the relationship between these things? Concern was, are we handing over control of the Hedera network to, you know, whoever happens to be writing the source code?
Right.
Do we trust them? Where's the trust model? How does this whole thing work? So I think the way that I think about this is that Hiero is where we develop the source code. Today, it's the Hashgraph team and the people that we work with develop that source code.
Hmm.
If you were to look at the maintainers on the consensus node software, for example, it's like all these people from Hashgraph,
Yeah.
formerly Swords Labs, formerly Hedera. Those are
Yeah.
the
Yeah.
ones
Yeah. Yeah.
who are there, right? And you know, so if you were to look at the relationship between the two things, you'd say Hiero is the place where the source code is developed. Hedera is a deployment of that source code.
Okay.
And Hedera needs to maintain control over what source code is actually deployed to their network. And
Gotcha.
there
There's a level of
is,
separation to that in a way.
yeah. And so, like, Hedera has a seat on the technical steering committee. The technical steering committee is made up of 9 individuals, um, with no more than 2 of them from any one company.
Okay.
There's a whole legal language that defines exactly what that means, but and Lehman is an exception. So Lehman sort of represents himself. He has a permanent seat on the TSC. Hedera has a seat on the TSC for the first 3 years, and then after that, their seat goes into being a normal one that gets elected. Then
Interesting.
there are maintainer seats. Basically, the maintainers of the different projects inside Hiero can elect people to sit on the technical steering committee. Then there is a seat for any contributor. So even if you're not a maintainer or a committer, but you have contributed source code, documentation, or something like that to the projects, you'll be eligible to vote for the contributor seat. You elect somebody to be sit as a
Mm.
contributor. And there's also an end user seat, which is for anybody who's, I'd say, like the karate combats and the Atmas and those sorts of
Right.
people in the world. Anybody who's using this product to build their businesses, they would be eligible to vote for a member that sits on the TSC. And then there's a couple seats that are filled by all the other people vote and elect a couple more people to fill it out. So there's like this whole decentralized rule set for who can sit on the technical steering committee. And critically, no more than 2 from any one company. Lehman representing himself and not Hashgraph. And that means that we're going to have a whole bunch of people there. It's not going to be the same faces that we've always seen. And I personally am hoping that there's going to be a lot. I have certain people that I hope end up getting elected to these positions, but
Nice. Yeah. Yeah.
that are totally outside of the normal set. I'm really bullish on that. I think that it would be phenomenal for this ecosystem to get some more of the builders and voices involved here, and at a very high level in terms of what
Yeah.
we're doing. So Hedera has some representation on the TSC, but they don't control it. They don't have any controlling
Right.
interest on it. It's the TSC members who get to decide, what code we're going to build. The HIP process is going to move. Yeah, it has moved. Now, I mean, we haven't actually move the repo over, but the HIP process is owned by the TSC. So if you have a new HIP, you'd come to the TSC to get it approved. The TSC will review the HIPs and vote on it. And again, there's only a handful of us from Hashgraph, a couple from LimeChain, one from Hedera, Lehman, and then a bunch of other people who have yet to be elected to fill those seats. So it should be very representative of the people who are actually building on Hedera or building Hedera that'll be representing that. Now, so we have some HIP. It comes through. We all vote for it. It's great. Hedera looks at the HIP. The governing council looks at it, and they say technical committee, TechCom, as we call it specifically, looks at the HIP and says, oh, that's a wonderful HIP. We love it. Then they can accept the HIP. Now, on the open source side, on Hiero, if I got my Hiero on, Hiero can go implement the HIPs that were approved by the technical steering committee, whether or not Hedera approves them.
Gotcha.
But Hedera will never deploy that code to mainnet if they don't approve of it. And we, as an open source community, are interested in supporting Hedera. So, there's going to be a partnership here. We're going to be saying, okay, you guys don't like that HIP. That's very important information. What can we do to make it acceptable? But we may find that there are some HIPs that will never be acceptable to them, but are necessary in the community. I'll give you an example. If we were doing like these, somebody wanted to take the Hiero source code and they wanted to build a network and run it behind a firewall for their bank. And let's say that they wanted to have some kind of service added to it that was, proprietary for their system. And they said, hey, but we could implement this in a way that's open source, and anybody who's doing something like us could reuse this code. And Hedera says, no, we don't want that on mainnet. Not a problem. We have spent, we shipped our modularized services code in June, I think, right? So we spent a good deal of time modularizing the code base. Consequently, we can actually take the Hiero source code and make a build of it for this, theoretical private usage. And we could do a build of it for Hedera. And Hedera still gets to deploy the code that they approve of. And we have, other builds that people can use for other purposes. That's all fine. So we're going to find ways, is it possible for there to be conflict between Hiero and Hedera? Yes. Is it likely? No. In the cases where there are differences, like for example, a voting service. Let's say that the community says, yes, we want to add a voting service to this source code base.
Yeah.
And we're like, Hedera's like, no, we don't really want to do that on mainnet. Great. We can still implement it on the open source side. And then Hedera could just say, yeah, I'm not going to take that module. And they deploy without the module.
Right.
That's fine. Those sorts of coordinations, I think, is what's going to happen. I have a really hard time seeing a future where Hiero and Hedera are truly at odds. I just don't really think that's going to happen. But any sort of misalignment of interest, we'll just work together in order to make sure that what is built and produced and deployed to mainnet is according to Hedera specifications. They control what code is deployed to mainnet. Hiero controls what code is developed, and the two of them together work together to make sure that the code that's developed can be deployed to mainnet.
Gotcha. So the hope here is kind of like for that best of both worlds scenario where, we want to be able to have these kind of unlimited possibilities for what this network can be, but still give Hedera the final decision on what makes it to mainnet. So this network can grow outside of potentially what Hedera wants it to be. And for enterprise usage or whatever it might be to deploy all these different networks. But then Hedera still has the ability to say, well, this is what we want our network. This is how we want our network to function. These are the pieces we're going to use. And there's a high likelihood you're saying that in the years to come, Hiero and then the code base that's used for the Hedera mainnet may look very different, and that's okay.
Yeah. I think it's unlikely to be very different, but It could be. And if it were, it's kind of like a Linux distribution in a way. There's a single Linux kernel. They produce a Linux kernel, but then you have all these different Linux distributions that are built off of the same kernel, right? A lot of the same open source code goes into all of them and different distributions. That's fine. I think that's good. Somebody else was asking like, well, are we giving away the value of our HBARs or whatever? Can anybody run the network? It's like, look, A network exists because of the network effect. It's just setting up a few nodes and saying, look, I have a new network doesn't really mean a lot.
Yeah.
There's a ton of effort that goes into, as you know, right? Getting the USDC or whoever else to deploy your network.
Yeah.
All the integrations, the bridges, the saucer swap, getting a DEX on there, or the wallets. There's this huge ecosystem around it. The likelihood of somebody being able to take Hiero, I mean, which they could have done anyway. All this code was open source anyway. Every one of these blockchains is open source anyway. You can do the same thing with Ethereum. You can do the same thing with any other network. Just go take the code and set up your own network. Good luck with that. That's going to be really hard to do.
Right.
So, I don't think I see this as like an unqualified improvement of the situation that we're in. There's no new risks that we're taking on. There's it just makes it more inclusive, more vendor neutral for control of the source code itself.
Gotcha. Okay, so what you're saying is, when people raise the question of, intellectual property and forking the network and this and that, and considerations for like potential competitors and other Hedera copies spinning up, what you're saying more so is that doesn't really have anything to do so much with having the code or being able to stand up a network. It's more to do with that network effect. Like, how do you get a governing council? How do you get a large group of validators? How do you get these DEXs? How do you get this liquidity on the network? Those are the real barriers and arguably kind of protections, competitive protections. And I think that there's another dynamic I'm kind of feeling here at play that I think is very healthy for Hedera. I think that this also places some additional very healthy pressure on Hedera to continue to kind of stay on the top of this Hiero mountain, and I think that is a very healthy thing, that it can be looked at as an incentive to say, okay, it's out here, everything's out in the open, and I think that definitely is an incentive for Hedera to really double down and deliver as a network, leveraging Hiero.
Yeah, and I think that they are very conscientious about wanting Hedera. I mean, what's interesting about our situation, right, is like when I first joined Hedera, like all the different aspects were in one house. We had the development in one place, we had the business development in one place, we had the marketing in one place, the governing council, Mance Lehman, Mance was the CEO, and everything else, all in one place. And then as those pieces have been factored out, it requires there's like the good and the bad of that, right? It's like monarchy versus democracy. You go down democracy's road, and there's a lot more coordination and competing interests and things like that you got to deal with. Monarchy is really nice and effective. You can get things done.
Sure.
But it's one of those things that's actually really frustrating to me personally. Is all the times on Twitter when people on other networks, not bad mouthing anybody, but they badmouth us by saying that, oh, we're not a decentralized. And I can tell you that decentralization is a very serious thing for everybody at Hedera, at Hashgraph. These moves that we make, you can see that we're putting our control where our mouth is.
Right.
And Hedera did that as well. The governing council is responsible for governing the operation of the public network. Right. But the code was broken out, and officially with Hiero broken out into the Linux Foundation for control. And business development was broken out. HBAR Foundation, Hashgraph Association, so it's like, there's a whole group of people, and it is a democracy. It really is. There's a lot of everybody's making their independent decisions to try to make this successful, and the governing council is very, very much interested in the success of the network. And I think that they demonstrated their willingness to put their control where their mouth is. It's like, not only are we interested in decentralization, but we're going to move the code to this independent organization as well. And I think they should be commended for that.
Yeah, 100%. Like it's definitely, from, as you've said, maybe from a purely business standpoint, this isn't something that necessarily benefits Hedera, but from a network standpoint, from a community standpoint, from a future standpoint, this is really the definition of like making those short-term sacrifices for long-term sustainability. So yeah, and that's why I kind of was telling people before you jumped on is like, I do feel this is really going to be, when we look back, this is going to be one of those turning points that is a component of this Hedera 2.0 that Mant and others are kind of speaking to. You know, the further decentralization of this, and not only just expanding Hedera, the tentacles of Hedera's ecosystem, but going into these other ecosystems, creating this kind of graph, this fabric between everything, that just, as you were saying, allows things to move more freely, and remove some of those